I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a second and to imagine Newark, New Jersey. Now open your eyes and look at me. I am from Newark. I live in Newark. I am love. I was born into a family of love. I grew up in a household filled with love. As an adult, I am committed to sustaining and building community. To me, this is love. To me, this is what shields us from opposition. The Newark I know is a city filled with resources. It's a city of diverse, interesting people who can trace their origins from all over the world. Filled with amazing institutions, including one of the heaviest populations of art galleries, a large museum, colleges and universities, unique architecture, and innovative businesses. Newark is a city where people enjoy being civically engaged, despite contrary rhetoric. It's a 227 housewives on Bravo kind of place, and that folks care about who you are, and they will get in your business. I was raised in downtown Newark, at the heart of all of this beauty, productivity, and nosiness. I grew up the youngest child in a tight-knit family, one of the younger children in my extended family, one of the youngest kids in my neighborhood. Growing up in this place provided me with an ideal upbringing in which I was allowed to simply exist. Almost everyone I interacted with knew me. In fact, people could remember the day I was born. I went to one elementary school, the same school as my older sibling, belonged to the same sports teams, sang in the same church choirs, rode my bike down familiar streets with welcoming neighbors. For many people, the first day of school with a new teacher and classmates demands a certain type of orientation. Yet my first days were more like attending a family reunion. You know, the family that you don't really know, the other side of the family, where everybody knows you, but you don't know anybody. They've heard all about your life, but they're strangers to you. Most often I entered spaces never having to talk, always being able to rely on people to look out for my interests, and usually able to escape opposition. This is my Newark. This is an experience that comes with some complications, but I wouldn't trade it for any other. The family, neighborhood, and city I grew up in was complete with protection, hard lessons, and most of all, love. Today I'm here to remind everyone that even beautiful things, love-filled lives, and promised lands experience deep opposition and conflict. I'm also here to suggest that we belong to a people and to a history and a place that provides solutions and lessons on how to deal with such opposition and conflict. That idea, the idea that how to live greatly in spite of opposition, has been provided to us by our ancestors. Many people believe Newark to be a city defined by unresolved issues, an exotic location filled with different kind of people who can't help but oppose one another, a people who only know conflict, a city that is typically portrayed as being stained by deficit, drained of culture, void of conventional ideas and civility. Newark is more than misunderstood, it is consistently insulted and bullied. Its contributions are devalued. Newark has been dragged, as we would say, forced into a particular type of bondage by decades of redlining, white supremacist policies, including war on drugs, mass incarceration, et cetera, et cetera. This beautiful city has experienced serious opposition. Having worked to empower Newark, I too know something about being dragged. I imagine that most of you have your own experiences being dragged and being opposed as well. Even with this, I consider myself to be a freedom lover, a person who has experienced so much love in his life that I work to share this love with the world versus being a freedom fighter. Beyond my daily interactions, my approach to sharing love includes taking responsibility for creating solutions in public policy, politics, and in activism. Our experiences with and our commitment to love will never shield us from opposition, though. In fact, doing this work might bring opposition more closely to us. There are countless examples that I could use to provide and demonstrate how I've encountered tribulations and oppositions, but today I'll briefly talk about two, and then talk about our history and how we can help to look to things in ways that we can solve them. The first incident is when a few friends and I and a few colleagues decided to work on creating safe spaces for young people in Newark. We had just recently launched an after-school program for young people, which is now a statewide after-school program in New Jersey. But we wanted to make something that was more available and supported the needs of lesbian, gay, and bisexual and transgender youth. The after-school program opened with broad support from the city, officials, the Board of Education, and a diverse contingent of people who were supportive of it. We faced virtually no opposition. The largest conflict that we had was how to raise enough money to support the program. Fast forward a few years later, and we realized those young people needed more than just after-school programs. They needed daily support with their identities and with the resources that they needed to survive. We decided that they needed a school, and there came the opposition. The school needed, as a new institution, needed to be co-located within another pre-existing school. We had developed a concept, and everything was underway. The school had an awesome social justice pedagogy. The money was in place, but their parents and a lot of the community members who were part of the existing school were in deep opposition to the school opening. They created a meeting that was titled really in opposition to LGBTQ students being housed in their school. Our group that had started this school and started the after-school program circulated an email about who could go to this meeting and really talk some sense into these folks who were opposing us. And I volunteered to go, stupidly. That evening when I arrived at the meeting, I could see that the community had come out in full force. The hallways leading up to the auditorium were filled with people. The auditorium itself was standing room only. I sat and listened to multiple presentations on why LGBTQ students should not have a supportive environment, blatantly, and more reasons why such an environment did not belong anywhere near quote-unquote normal kids. In this moment, I realized that I was the only person in the room in support of the new school. Thought about turning back. My first words when I introduced myself to speak to the audience were just an introduction of myself and who I was, and that I was in support of LGBTQ youth. Immediately, without being prompted, there were shouts from the audience, sexual slurs. People who had sat quietly the entire evening started booing and screaming me down. The room became abysmally hostile. I knew I was in a place of opposition. This was not the city that I grew up in. It wasn't a city that I knew. It wasn't Newark. It was a foreign place. Another instance is when I worked for two prominent mayors, as my introduction talked about, in the tri-state area. They're nationally recognized for their innovations and visions, even their social justice leanings. As a specialist in urban policy, it was my pleasure to contribute to such leadership, to increase the capacity of the communities in which they served. And I did this work for a little over 6 years. Like hundreds of other brown and black men across the tri-state area, I became a victim of violent policies such as stop and frisk, verbal assaults by law enforcement officers, even once at gunpoint. All of these experiences took place in public in front of the communities I've always felt loved in, always felt safe in. I spent a career actively working to promote and enhance these places. There's arguably nothing more traumatizing than this, nothing more degrading than being told your existence is dependent on the discretion of a police officer. Nothing more violent, except homicide itself, than being faced with the barrel of a gun for simply existing. These experiences inform me that we have all faced opposition and conflict. We currently live in a state, America, that is determining our ability to exist and working to diminish our potential in various ways. Even with the weight of opposition and conflict, we have the possibility to endure, to empower one another, and to create freedom. And our history tells us this. It is filled with so many examples, again, but today I'd like to focus on one strategist, a military veteran, a train conductor, a freedom lover, and arguably America's most heroic figure, Harriet Tubman. Often I think about our many ancestors and how they lived, what their expectations were, what they dreamed about. Even though I can't imagine the oppression and traumatic instances that they experienced, I realize that there's something in common that we share with them. We share a common expectation and desire to live in love and to do so freely. Tubman is celebrated as a symbol of freedom because her expectations were so high in an environment with such low performance. She was a person committed to helping those in bondage, and she risked her life to guiding people out of enslavement. Even in elementary school, I learned about her and the risk that she faced. They talked about the mosquitoes and the snakes and the harsh elements that Harriet surely faced when she traveled up and down the East Coast. They talked about the potential threat of her escaping slave catchers who were doing their work for reward money. They also talked about the opposition she would occasionally face from other slaves that she saved because they were fearful of the life that existed for them after enslavement. But what's not often discussed is the personal conflicts and opposition that she faced throughout her life. Tubman was born somewhere between 1820 and 1825 to Harriet and Ben Ross, her parents. They were a loving couple, and all evidence shows that they were extremely supportive of their children. However, they were held in bondage by the Borders family, particularly Edward Borders, who was the patriarch. The love Harriet received from her parents and sibling was challenged by this circumstance. She received frequent abuse from her slave owners as a child. Harriet's older siblings, 3 of them to be exact, were sold away from the family into slavery, and this tormented the very structure of her family. These were probably her earliest memories of oppression and opposition. Harriet and her family were held captive in the Upper South, the state of Maryland, where approximately half of black people living in that state were born free and lived freely. The other half, of course, enslaved. The concept of freedom was something that Harriet could tangibly see. She could see it every day going out into the streets, and she knew free people, so she knew that there was another way of living. As a young person, she started to investigate what the circumstances of her family would be, and if there was potential for her family to be free. And she did this after experiencing even the resistance that her mother would face. Harriet's younger sibling was going to be sold. Her youngest brother was going to be sold at one point. And her mother took refuge and hid the child amongst the free black community in Maryland for up to a month, thinking that the slave owner would change his mind. When they brought the child back, the slave owner, the Borders, had not changed their mind. And Harriet's mother locked herself in the house and said that, if you're going to sell my child, you are going to meet severe violence upon entering this home, as we talked about. This is, again, one of Harriet's first examples of resistance. And she used this example, again, as I mentioned, to confront the possibility that her family could potentially live in freedom. At the age of 15, while running errands for her owners, she was at a local store and encountered an overseer who was attacking a man who had left the plantation without permission that day. The overseer asked for Harriet's help in trying to capture the man, but she refused. And while the man escaped, Harriet suffered a blow to the head by a 2-pound weight that was meant for that man escaping freedom. This is a blow and an injury that caused Harriet severe pain and sickness for the rest of her life. Again, a lesson that resistance can cause potential danger. Again, even though she experienced it, she continued to investigate the status of her family's legal status, eventually enticing a lawyer to work on her behalf. What she found was that her father was guaranteed freedom at the age of 45, so was her mother, and so were all of her siblings. This increased Harriet's anger. She became increasingly angry with the family that was holding her captive. And at the same time, she noticed that the slave owners were continually active in trying to sell her and her siblings into slavery further south. She started to pray about it as a solution, praying that her owners would change their mind. Eventually, she saw this wasn't going to work, so she prayed for her owner's death, and he died. Ironically, this death caused financial strain for the family, the slave owner family, and increased their desire to sell not only Harriet's siblings, but Harriet herself. Even while Harriet was sick, she decided that she was going to take destiny into her own hands, and she escaped, making her way to Philadelphia in a trip that probably took her about 3 weeks. After reaching Philadelphia, Harriet could have easily enjoyed her newfound freedom without serious conflict. She describes the moment she arrived in Philadelphia saying she was a stranger in a strange land. My father, my mother, my brothers and sisters and friends were in Maryland, but I was free, and they should be free. This quote from her is a clear example that shows that she was happy she had received her freedom, but freedom really did not mean that much without her family. She was inspired to take freedom as an effort to preserve her family, so she knew she had to make her way back south. And this began her long career of freeing other folks. She worked for about a year saving money, and within a year she went down to save her niece and her niece's 2 children who were next up for sale. And she did that successfully. Her very next trip was an effort to save her husband, which turned out to be another example of opposition that she faced because her husband refused to go with her. He had found a new wife. Giving new meaning to her quote, her famous quote, "If I had freed 1,000 slaves, I could have freed 1,000 slaves if only they knew they were slaves," right? But she didn't stop there. On that very same trip, she decided to free 3 other men and went back up north. She continued this work, freeing. There's evidence that she freed at least 300 individuals out of slavery on her own. When the Civil War began, the governor of Massachusetts, knowing about her work and extensive knowledge of the South, asked her to be a spy. She gladly accepted. This became one of her many contributions to the United States Army. She destroyed infrastructure, burned homes and buildings, captured farm tools and equipment, destroyed bridges, all in an effort to end slavery. She was asked to go on a mission to South Carolina because she knew that terrain very well. And on that mission, she freed 700 people from various plantations, allowing them to escape to slavery, to escape out of slavery. In her service, she experienced extreme opposition doing this work. One time on an army camp, other freed slaves complained about the compensation that she was receiving because they weren't getting paid. Instead of complaining about it, she decided to forego compensation, thinking that she would be paid later. She never was. And decided to take up work, making money in other ways. So even in her efforts to free people, she experienced extreme hate. Tubman experienced other detractors and acts of betrayal along the way. As an elderly woman, she built a home for the aged and spent all of her savings doing that work and was essentially broke. In an effort to receive more money, 2 folks from the South had reached out to her. Harriet, knowing about the work of slave owners, and many of them hid their treasures and their money while the Union armies were taking over plantations, she knew about this. And they kind of took advantage of her knowledge of this work and said that, "We know where some treasure is buried. If you give us $2,000, we can find this money, and we'll gladly give you $5,000 in return." And of course, she was cheated out of this money and died broke. The idea is that Harriet never gave up on trying to help people, and she never gave up on her dreams. But in doing this work, she always received deep opposition and conflict. She knew that from her very beginnings, the idea of freedom was something that was illogical. Her circumstances prescribed something very different for her. Creating freedom for herself and the hundreds of people that she eventually did was something that was impossible for many people like her during her time. But her responses to opposition and her responses to conflict made humanity far more possible for millions of people. Her indirect contributions to the Civil War freed millions. Her direct contributions leading people on the Underground Road freed hundreds. In closing, I'd like to say that knowing that what your gifts are and knowing that you come from a beautiful place, again, doesn't prevent you from receiving deep opposition, but it does call you to face this opposition and to do so continually throughout your life. The response is, and the results are freedom for many and freedom for yourself. Thank you.